OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about section 24 of Belonging Again, where we will continue discussing the work of Peter Berger, a very impressive sociologist who recently passed, but whose work is as pressing as ever. Mr. Berger emphasizes that where there is a lack of meaning, there tends to be a lack of identity, which will cause existential anxiety that makes authoritarianism appealing. And what's very important also is that nobody indeed, in action, to allude to Wittgenstein, thinks that they are supporting authoritarianism because it always comes across to them as the right thing to do. That's why the banality of evil is so difficult. No one who has been absorbed into the banality of evil views it as the banality of evil. It is the right thing to do, or it is the everyday way of life. There's a way in which it gets interpreted to the self as a good thing. And one of the ways you can fight this is with mediating structures of the society, which are social gathering places, the Lions Club, bowling clubs, these things that, and Robert Putnam is very good on this. He wrote a book called Belonging Again, and he's done a lot to discuss the collapse of mediating structures in the social order that help socialize people. And one of the values of the mediating structures is that it helps bring different kinds of people together, to encounter difference so that people can get a little more familiar with difference, so that difference is not so jarring. When you're an isolated individual and then you turn on the news and you're listening and encountering different people, say if you're liberal and you turn on the news and hear about conservatives, or if you're conservative and you hear about liberals, or we can go through the religions and so on and so forth. When you receive that difference from the television, it doesn't have any personalized experience. And so it is incredibly jarring, and it's emotionally much more jarring. Whereas if you have regular encounter with difference, it's not as jarring because you're more familiar with it. One of the reasons people talk about college being so important is precisely diversity. You can encounter diversity, you can meet different points of views, you can have experiences that kind of make you learn how to be with people that don't think like you, and yet that is not existentially destabilizing to you, because naturally difference is existentially destabilizing. It's very difficult for people to handle difference, but college has this function of making people encounter diversity. Well, that's better than nothing. But without mediating social structures, that's just 4 years of diversity for most people, and it's not a regular encounter with diversity. And so they become increasingly fragile regarding diversity, and diversity is more existentially unstabilizing. And when that occurs, and they encounter diversity, as people inevitably do in pluralism, or at least you can't avoid it in the news, then the reaction tends to be poor. You tend to have a turn to authoritarianism. And the thing also is, another really important function of mediating structures is you also encounter people who think like you and that help you understand the way you think. So you get this balance of social support and encountering difference in a manner that you can handle, so that you can become familiar with existential destabilization, but also get some levels of affirmation so that it's not all at once. And this helps you gradually develop, like a bicycle, like training wheels on a bicycle, and then you gradually move to a place where you can use a normal bicycle. But without these mediating social structures, these places that bring people together regularly, and outside of work, mind you. Now, work has a nice function too, because that can be, you have to go to work, so you encounter different kinds of people, co-workers, customers, and so on and so forth. But the issue is, work usually has a task. It's better than nothing. But if you're, say, the cashier, you're focused on, selling the product or getting it across the register and doing the numbers. You're not really meeting the person. Yes, you're seeing difference, but you're not necessarily facing difference or encountering difference on a personal, deep level. So work's better than nothing, but it doesn't tend to be a strong mediating structure. And you see, what Berger also wants us to understand is we may try desperately to hold on to our meaning and identity, but in the absence of others in our immediate environment confirming our identity, we will find it almost impossible to maintain it within our own consciousness. So if we are surrounded by radical difference, so it's almost like the worst of all possible worlds with the loss of mediating structures, like, again, the Lions Club, or all these, like, again, the stuff Robert Putnam talks about in Bowling Alone, or these different books. Without those, not only do you not encounter difference, you also do not get any affirmation of people who share your givens. So you don't have any givens, and you don't have any encounter with difference. So then difference really existentially destabilizes you. And Berger's going to now emphasize some of the roles of the why we need givens. Because again, in the absence of others in our immediate environment confirming our identity, we will find it almost impossible to maintain it. We become existentially overwhelmed. Birds of the same feather flock together, not as luxury, but out of necessity. And to give people that feeling of being supported, you have plausibility structures Berger's going to talk about, mediating structures of the society, and all of these are what makes society possible. Without these, society becomes impossible, which is why our atomized world today, where institutions, mediating structures are all collapsed, is really bad. Now, we do have a hanging question, and I do think some of these online communities, Indie Thinker, Other Life, Halcon Guild, these different lots of online communities, Voicecraft, is a sign of people trying to create new mediating structures. And we have to ask if there's a difference between doing it in person and doing it online. I am not sure. But there, you can see here a effort to bring them back because they have a necessary function. Berger's going to say how every society must maintain multiple realities in a manner that keeps the lack of fit between any given subjectivity and the social reality from feeling too extreme. We talked about in the last section about how the role of society is to make sure that individual subjectivities do not feel too disconnected from the social order, because if that occurs, then you can get people feel like they don't belong. And that's arguably what's happened today. And plausibility structures and mediating structures are all part of helping people feel like their subjective view of the world, their beliefs have fit with the social order. If there's no fit at all, it's really bad. And Berger's going to talk about how externalizations is at the core of people's world-building activity. And if people feel as if their subjective reality cannot at all extend into society, they will feel like they are in a prison. So people have to feel like they can extend their subjectivity into the world to some degree freely and without rejection. You could say that people have to get a certain level of yes, to use that language from Philip Reeve. If they get too much no, they get upset and they tend to respond poorly. This is already quite tough because you already just have the raw scandal of other self-consciousnesses that Zizek will talk about. And Trey recently mentioned this in his tremendous video on Zizek and 666, which was remarkable at Telos Bound. But there's this idea that the encounter of the other, there's kind of a scandal there. It's very difficult to imagine that other people have a self-consciousness just like ours. Because we can never occupy our own, any self-consciousness but our own. And so other self-consciousnesses naturally don't feel as real as ours. For Hegel, that's why the self-consciousness is experienced as absolute. It is the absolute, and yet it is inherently limited, but we don't experience those limited limits because our self-consciousness is necessarily experienced as absolute, and that gets into Hegel. So there's already a scandal of the existence of other people, and the social order has to be designed in such a manner that we can live with that scandal, where that scandal isn't overwhelming and that we don't respond to it poorly. So there has to be mediating structures, as Berger will talk them, and there has to be plausibility structures. These structures that familiarize us with difference in a gradual manner, like training wheels on a bike, so it doesn't overwhelm us, but also at the same time, not so much difference that then we feel like we don't have any social support, because when that occurs, we fall into existential anxiety, and that's when totalitarianism becomes so appealing. And then nobody feels like they're home. And you see this, of course, is a tension because as the world is globalized and becomes more pluralistic, by definition, there has to be more retreat of people's subjectivities into smaller and smaller spheres to make space for the other. Because if not, it's totalitarianism. Because whatever subjectivity has the most extension will have power over everyone else. So there has to be this balancing, this divvying out of subjective spaces that people need to occupy. Which is quite difficult, which people tend to respond to by retreating too much, and it is very difficult to manage that, and you will not manage it without mediating structures, which, again, we've unfortunately increasingly lost. And you see, the thing is that totalitarianism promises to resolve this tension, but it does so in a perverse way of course, just erasing difference. You can always solve this problem by erasing difference, but of course, erasing difference is evil. That's violence. That's war. That's failure. But that's the temptation. And this also begins to explain why violence and war and different things starts to occur. Whenever we read the history books and read about the violence of the past, or World War II, or World War I, Civil War, whatever, there can be this kind of like, why would people do that? That's crazy. Why would you do this sort of thing? Well, I'm sure those people read back on Rome, or maybe the Mongols or different thing like 100 years ago, and they're like, man, why were people so violent? We're so enlightened now. Like, every age has a tendency to feel like it's enlightened and it will never fall into violence again. But by reading a Reef or a Berger or Freud, you start to understand how it happens. It happens because of the breakdown of the ability to feel like they fit in the social order, which then, of course, they associate whatever helps them feel like they fit in the social order with being moral, and that makes it moral to destroy difference. Then it becomes moral to destroy difference. And so, you go and you kill people who disagree with you, and then the world falls back into violence. And you see, you always, every social order has to have some sort of governing structure of some kind. So you already right there have the potential of people feeling alienated because they feel like there's these politicians or this king or queen or whoever that controls their lives. And arguably, that's government is a necessary evil. I mean, that's an entirely different discussion. But if you have a government, there's always the threat of feeling alienated, and if people feel alienated, they can revolt against the government. One of the functions of plausibility structures and mediating structures is to help people not feel alienated by the state or by the governing body. So if that's gone, well, then you have trouble. You have a lot of trouble, and because then it's just a matter of time before people attack. Now, I think we see in pluralism what people are attempting to do is, rather than have a restrictive moral order based on a religion that can other people, and again, where there are givens, there could be the banality of evil. This cannot be denied. But you see, we've been talking so much about finding this balance between givens and releases, the individual and the society, and how difficult that is to strike. Well, my gosh, what Berger and Putman and all them want to discuss is that the likelihood of finding that balance without mediating social structures, which are not merely extensions of capitalism, which arguably college has become now, because you go to college to get a job. Without those social centers, the likelihood of finding the balance between givens and releases is incredibly low and incredibly unlikely, and that's what they're all so concerned about. But one of the things we've tried to do, I think, to stabilize people or to have people live together without killing one another, is to create an ethical system of consent, which is the idea that what is right and what is wrong is based on what consenting adults want to do, what people agree to do together. And there's a lot of legitimacy to consent as a valid structure. But you see, the issue is that consent means choice, and choice means freedom. And that means existentialism. The problem with an ethic of consent is that it is very existentially demanding. You have to make a choice and be responsible for that choice. You have to bear the burden of the real, to reference Lacan, and that is very existentially difficult. Certainly, there are people that can do that. There can be delusive individuals, as Beauty Saves we'll talk about, and philosopher kings, and then people who are philosophically trained and maybe intrinsically motivated, who can handle an ethic of consent. But lots of people, that's going to be very existentially overwhelming. And Berger's going to say that the social contract cannot be renegotiated every day by millions of individual consenting adults, not unless society is to lapse into intermediate chaos. So here's the thing. Where you have an ethic of consent, then the social contract has to be negotiated perpetually between the consenting adults or the consenting people, and that in of itself contributes to atomization and separation, because people consent to different things. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but it is an ethic that is not going to necessarily solve the problem of belonging again, precisely because it has to dissolve the social contract. The social contract basically is a shared ethical system of some kind. And the issue is that the social contract can't merely be law. Like right now, yeah, there's law, but law isn't the same as ethics. And ethics tends to be what gives people shared intelligibility. The fact that I'm in a society where I'm not supposed to murder anyone. Strangers and I both agree to the premise that we shouldn't murder people, but that's not going to create a strong bond. But if you have a stranger who's a Christian who consents to, say, the Eucharist or going to church every Sunday, and I also am a Christian, there's more shared intelligibility. So as law moves from, as you move from law to ethics, you move to stronger shared intelligibility and the possible of creating belonging and understanding of one another. And again, consent is a good thing, but to have consent as an ethical premise is probably going to side very far in the direction of releases, which again, that means you're going to have less likelihood for the banality of evil that and Nazism and all that comes as Hannah Arendt describes regarding givens. But where consent is the main ethic, you're also going to have more existential anxiety and probably more tribalism and more splitting apart of the social order into individual groups of whom consent to the same things. That's what ends up happening. Like the doctrine of consent almost has to lead to tribalism, because the people that understand one another are ones who similarly consent, and those individuals will form a community and other people will form the communities they form, and that could be good. I mean, it's better than nothing, and certainly, if you have a macro, like, your entire state is Christian, but you don't share in Christianity, you're going to feel oppressed, so consent can stop that. Again, banality of evil, but it's not necessarily going to be enough to create belonging. And it can lead to perhaps, like we've said, existential anxiety, which can lead to mental illness because you have to so constantly renegotiate the intelligibility space in which you are occupying with other people. Berger has been describing this, and again, the likelihood, and also it should be noted that an ethic of consent without mediating structures or plausibility structures is not going to be able to have a consent doctrine of which unifies large groups or large groups of people, because you're not going to be able to easily locate or socially organize or logistically organize large groups of people. So then what ends up happening is the consent ethic, which maybe would work better if you had mediating structures and plausibility structures and social gatherings, because it could be more collective. What ends up happening is it's not going to be able to go much beyond just two individuals or a very small group of individuals in their life. And, maybe 10 people consent to similar ways of life, but 10 people is very small compared to a social order. So that's likely not to create a feeling of fit or belonging. We've been kind of pointing at this question of, how do we restore givens, and how do we restore them in a way where they're open enough to let people be themselves without feeling oppressed, but not so open that there's chaos. And, a question we have to explore is it possible to regain givens once you lose them? Or is it the case that once the spider web breaks, as Wittgenstein says, it's not possible to put back together? In a similar question is, once you lose mediating structures and plausibility structures, is it possible to bring them back? Or are they gone forever? That's a question that we have here, that Putman and Berger and these different people are interested in. And again, I do think you see online communities forming that are trying to create new social spaces to help be these mediating structures. And what we'll have to wonder is how they develop moving into the future, and if they can perhaps restore these necessary social structures that we need to not cave into the existential anxiety that result when we feel alone and not supported. For more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Anchor, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all these things. And thank you so much for your time.